If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who used to not believe in ghosts, paranormal, supernatural, etc., but do now, what unnerving encounter changed your mind? A buddy got separated from the rest of his patrol in a swamp. It was a training mission, but still not a great situation. At night, after wandering around for a while and becoming thoroughly lost, he ran into 3 dudes in the darkness. Thinking they were part of one of our sister units that were also out that night, he asked where our platoon was. They pointed him our way, and he wandered up less than 5 minutes later. I asked where he'd been, and he told me the story. The only thing was, and I confirmed this with the patrol leader, that we were the last element in the movement and no one should have been where the 3 men were. We found out later that 3 soldiers died in those swamps in the 90s on a similar mission, and ever since then, multiple soldiers lost and alone in those swamps have encountered 3 soldiers who've guided them back to their comrades. I lived in Australia for a few years, a while back. Not long after I'd moved there, a couple of my ex-girlfriend friends invited me to one of their friends' BBQs. With the house being fairly outside the city and me living in the city center, the hosts offered to put me up for the night, and I accepted since I had no idea where I actually was location-wise. The bed they had set up for me was like a floor bed situated in the kitchen, dining room, or conservatory area. It was a decent-sized house. So I'm lying in this bed, asleep, and I get woken by this noise. I can only describe it as sounding like a stone or pebble bouncing several times. Like a tat-tat-tat noise. Something is being thrown and skipping along the floor. I woke up slightly disoriented and confused, waking in a strange environment, and I hear this noise again and realize that facing the bottom of my bed is an open door. My goosebumps have just kicked in while I type. That door leads immediately to another door, facing to the left, that's ajar, and I think it leads to a room or closet. I wasn't brave enough to properly look. I hear the noise again and realize it's coming from that room or closet. The noise was repetitive but different each time. Anyway, I suddenly started to become really scared, a genuine fear. I lie there for what seems like an age, listening to this tat-tat-tat, tat-tat-tat-tat every minute or so. I eventually build up the courage to jump up, and I run to the ajar door, shut it, and pull the bolt across it, then shut the open door and dive back into bed. I'm lying there, adrenaline going, and I'm starting to calm down a bit, and out of nowhere I hear this noise. My goosebumps just went wild, ha! The bolt on the inner door just snapped open, and I hear the door creak as it opens ajar again. A few seconds of silence and tat-tat-tat. It's probably the closest I've even been to a heart attack. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, and I politely refused to hang around the next day. Okay. There I was in my best friend's house with my now ex-girlfriend. All of a sudden, a rapid tapping on my bedroom door. I thought it was my friend scrounging for a condom or something. Open the door, and no one is out there. I was about to head back in when I heard the door pop open down the hall. It's my friend's head popping out, asking if I had knocked at his door. We were both in the hallway laughing about it at this point. Then, the sound of footsteps made their way up the stairs towards us. We could track each step on each floorboard. It stopped 2 steps from the top. There was no one there. I still slept like a baby that night. My mother passed away when I was 16. She had been sick in the hospital, but I never knew that it was that bad. My parents were always telling my older sister and me that it was just a virus and that it was passing. I finished working at my fast food job after school and went home to change before visiting my mother at the hospital. My sister was on her way home to do the same. I heard the side door open, expecting my sister, and heard my mom say, "Finally home." I was getting changed, so I couldn't just run out of my room, but I was super happy. But when I came out, no one was home. Then, my sister drove up the driveway, and I went outside. We drove straight to the hospital. This was just before cell phones were popular, so we didn't have anyone contact us. When we got to the hospital, we went to the room. My dad was waiting for us. We knew it was bad news because my mom wasn't in bed. He was crying. His words, "She's home," he meant she was in heaven. My dad died last March. For a week and a half after he died, I kept waking up at exactly 4:40 a.m. Then one night, I had a very vivid dream. In the dream, I went to my parents' house. He was standing in the living room, in a hospital gown, like I had last seen him in, silently looking out the window into the backyard. He had this soft, content smile on his face. Didn't look at me or say anything. I called out to him, "Dad," and jolted awake. 4:40 a.m. I told my mom about it, and she was shaken. She had just spread his ashes in the backyard flowerbed the day of the dream. This flower bed is what you see if you look out the window he was staring out of in my dream. I was not aware she had spread his ashes that day. And 4:40 a.m. was the time he woke up every morning. She showed me the alarm on his alarm clock. I haven't seen him again since, and after that time, I stopped waking up at 4:40. When I was 14, I agreed to look after my neighbor's cats while they were away. They left me a key to their house, and I was supposed to go over once every day to feed the cats and check on them. But when I was walking over the following evening, I saw an older woman in one of the windows of the upper floor, staring at me. I got a little confused and turned, walking back home, thinking that maybe I had mistaken the day or if they had someone else check on the cats. The next day, the same thing happened. I walked over again, and I saw the same woman staring at me from a window, but this time on the first floor. I called my neighbor then, and they got worried and told me to call the police because no one was supposed to be in there. I called, and the police came, but the house was empty, except for the cats. I stayed in the house while the police left and fed the cats. I left soon after. I came over and fed the cats as I had promised, but the whole thing gave me the creeps. I never saw the woman again. But the cats refused to leave the living room. I grew up in a very scientific family. I never knew my dad's stance on ghosts, but they were never talked about, so it really didn't matter. One day when I was in high school, we were eating dinner, and I decided to ask my dad about our old house and moving into it when I was just a baby. So he told me a story. Apparently, when we moved into this house, we lived there for about a week before we started to receive gifts once a week. Every Friday morning, my dad told me that there would be some sort of handcrafted gift sitting on the mantle of our fireplace. My dad was reasonably freaked out by this because we were the only ones with keys to the house, and the last owner moved well out of state. So, he informed the local police, and they decided to patrol the property every Friday night looking for intruders. They found nothing, and as you could imagine, the gifts kept coming. So my dad told me they eventually gave up, and feeling helpless, he went to our local church. Eventually he had a priest come and bless the house, and we stopped receiving the gifts. What really freaked me out about this was the fact that my dad never believed in ghosts and didn't mention once that a ghost was causing these gifts to appear. He's an engineer, so he always tries to debunk people's paranormal stories with a realistic explanation, but he was 100% serious with this. One of the gifts we received we actually still have. It's a wooden sled with a small painting of a man, presumably my dad, pulling me and my sister on the sled. We received this gift about 8 months ago, a year before my mother passed away from cancer, so that made the painting on the sled very freaky in hindsight. My dad only told me this story once, and he denied ever telling me it when I asked him about it recently. When I was in my late 20s, I was dating my girlfriend, my soon-to-be wife. We had been together for a while. One summer, on July 3rd, her sister was killed. All the men were eventually caught and tried. The trials and the aftermath for the family were devastating and debilitating for them for many, many years. Fast forward 3 months, after the funeral. I arrived at my girlfriend's house to wait for her to get off her job as a nurse at a local hospital. Neither of her parents were home. Just me, alone in the house. So I went into the family room, turned on the TV, sat down on the couch, got comfortable, and began to watch. Clear as a bell I heard my girlfriend's sister's voice in my right ear, just off my shoulder, call my name. I turned to look at the seat next to me, and of course there was nobody there. I stared at the spot on the couch next to me for a long while. Feeling a bit uneasy, I turned off the TV and went outside to wait on the porch. I told this to my wife. She said her parents heard odd noises from her sister's room all the time. And they would catch movement out of the corner of their eyes around the house. My girlfriend's grandfather's ashes were on a little shelf in the living room, right next to a very solid/heavy angel statue. Well, one weekend she and I are fooling around on the living room couch, and out of the corner of my eye, I see the angel statue fly off the wall, accompanied by a deep grunt. Now when I say this thing flew off the wall, I'm talking about 7 to 8 feet of air before landing on the hardwood and leaving a dent where the wing hit. Even if this thing had fallen off the wall, it would have dropped straight down, not soared with force. Well, we both stood there in shock, and I whispered if she had heard the grunt as well, to which she agreed. So we both booked it for the day. Well, that night at dinner, we told her parents what happened, leaving out the naughty bit, and Megan's younger sister burst into tears, saying she had seen a dark figure at the foot of her bed the last couple nights but didn't want anyone to think she was crazy. The grandfather that died had mental health issues that caused a lot of pain. After that day, I was a believer. I slept over at my buddy's house. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of a woman crying coming from right outside his bedroom. I figured it was his mom arguing with another family member, so at first I felt very awkward rather than scared. Then things began getting more intense. She started screaming, $7? You did this for $7? And as she began getting louder and louder, I thought I might need to intervene before someone got hurt. I stood up, walked to the door, grabbed the handle, and then opened the door. Instant, dead silence. Every sound I heard died in a heartbeat. It went from being in a World War II war zone to being able to hear a mouse fart. Outside his room, every light in his house was off, there was no one else awake, nothing. I still can't explain what happened. I woke my friend up, and he told me he once saw a lady in a white gown walking up his steps and thought it was his mom, but when she didn't respond to him calling out to her, he followed her up the stairs, and when she turned a corner, she disappeared. Then one day, when they are moving out of this house, his cousin and sister arrive at the new house after grabbing some things from the old one and telling everyone that they swore they saw a girl in a white gown standing at the upstairs window as they pulled out of the driveway. When I was 5 years old, I woke up in the night, and my grandma was standing at the end of my bed, wearing a teal blue skirt and a matching blouse. I remember that it was summer and the sky was still light but not light enough for me to read, so I guess it was about 9 p.m. I sat up, she put her finger to her lips, and I rubbed my eyes a couple of times, 'cause I was sleepy, and when I looked back, she had gone. I just snuggled back under my covers, thinking how nice it was to see her because I hadn't seen her for ages, and I hoped she would still be there when I woke up. The next morning, my house was eerily quiet. My mom was in a worse mood than normal, but she had been crying, so I asked her what was wrong. My grandma died the night before. She had been crossing a road after her bingo turned out. At 8:30 p.m., about 60 miles away from where we lived, she had a massive brain hemorrhage in the middle of the road and didn't even make it to the other side, let alone to my house, which is 60 miles away. She was wearing a teal blue skirt and matching blouse. Most of my family is extremely religious and believes in ghosts wholeheartedly. Most of them claim to have seen something paranormal at some point in their lives. I wasn't very religious, and I always thought to myself, if I haven't seen it, then it's not real. That changed during my senior year of high school. I was dog-sitting at my great-aunt's house while she was out of town for a few days. A little after midnight, I'm watching a movie, and my aunt's dog starts barking like crazy and runs up the stairs at full speed. The dog was small, but fierce. Suddenly, I heard a gravelly voice at the top of the stairs say, "Bad doggy." The voice was deep and masculine. I went upstairs because I was certain nobody else was supposed to be there. I looked around, and there was nobody in sight. The dog was still barking at something that I couldn't see. She was just barking at an empty hallway. That's when I heard footsteps walking away from us down the hall and into my aunt's bedroom. I could hear the footsteps, but I couldn't see anybody making them. I noped the duck out of that house with the dog and went outside in my car. The dog and I slept there for the night. I'm not entirely sure what I experienced that night, but I definitely believe in the paranormal now. I never told my aunt about what happened, but apparently my great-uncle, her husband, had died in that house a few months after I was born. I never knew him, but I'm willing to bet that it was him who I heard that night. Not about me, but this one's about my 3 brothers. We used to live in the Philippines, where everyone believed in ghosts, duwendes, dwarves, diwatas, fairies, etc. Our old home was the second house built in our subdivision, so it was very old, with huge mango, santal, and other fruit trees growing all over. As my mom had told me, my 3 brothers were playing around shooting these bamboo bows and arrows made for them by one of our helpers. It was all fun and games until my 3rd brother shot his arrow, and according to him and my brothers, it stopped mid-air and dropped. Needless to say, they found this weird and stopped playing. On the next day, my brother was suddenly hit with a high fever out of nowhere. They were going to take my brother to my aunt, who was a doctor, but my older brothers told my mom about the arrow stopping mid-air. My mom decided to take him to an albulario, who is, I think, a practitioner of folk medicine, correct me if I'm wrong. So my mom took my brother to this guy so they could find out what had happened and what they could do. Once they met up, the albulario decided to do a ritual that involved dripping candle wax into water to see what caused the sickness. Once they did this, a small humanoid figure formed in the water, but it was missing a hand. The albulario told my mom that my brother probably shot an arrow and hit duwende's hand, which is why he got hit with a fever as punishment. I don't know exactly what they did to ask for forgiveness, but apparently my brother got better the next day. So this one time I woke up to our dogs going nuts. Not like yap yap howl, I mean, like they were shrieking. They were screaming like they were eating each other. I jumped up out of bed and grabbed the broom. I took off into the night buck-ass naked, And when I was about 10 feet away, I saw the werewolf at the corner of the dog's fence. It turned and stood up, looking me straight in the eyes. The dogs were still yelping like they were on fire. From behind, I heard my wife yell, "Get back inside." I was standing face to face with a Frivkin werewolf. Naked with a broomstick. I slowly backed up, my broom raised like a bat, till I was able to trip back into the airstream. We sat at the window, hair raised, hearts pounding, as it just stared at us for several minutes. It eventually retreated back down into the narrow valley. You don't tend to forget such things. Or not believe in them. We both saw it. And it came back every few days to throw sticks and large rocks into the dog kennel. When I was 4, we moved into a large old town house. Every summer we would go on holiday, and one of my many cousins would look after the house. Go in on an afternoon, turn on the lights, close the curtains, etc. Sometimes when they would go out partying, they would stay at ours because it was walking distance from town. The first cousin said never again. They said someone was watching them when they woke up during the night and left. Then the second cousin said something similar, and then the third said they saw someone fall from the ceiling and land on top of them. Slowly, each family member refused to stay over. We even had neighbors say they would see someone walking around our house and were wondering why we would not answer. I never saw anyone, but I swear, I used to always hear someone in the loft coming down the creaky old ladders or someone coming upstairs. We eventually moved when I was 17. A lot of stuff that people experience, including myself, can be easily debunked by science and physics. Low-frequency standing air waves or high levels of EM radiation affecting brain function, pareidolia, mass hysteria, hypnagogic hallucinations due to sleep paralysis or sleep deprivation, etc. But one experience. My sister and I were exploring this abandoned mansion in Fair Oaks, California. Not ghost hunting or anything, just experiencing a house that has been frozen in time for over 100 years. It was the middle of the afternoon, and both of us were wide awake. As we made our way to the 3rd floor, we would both hear random bumps and odd noises behind us, but we wrote it off as just the effects of 2 people walking through a wooden structure with unstable foundations. We got to the attic door, and it wasn't locked but still warped in the frame and jammed shut. We were discussing whether or not to force it open when, from less than 3 feet behind us. "Please don't." It was as clear as day, as if a young woman were standing right behind us. We got the duck out of there quickly. In our old house, there was a lot of really creepy stuff that happened. My son wouldn't go to sleep until we told the boy in his room that it was time for bed and that he needed to go home. We kind of got used to that, and I figured he was just ducking with me. Cut to 2 weeks before we move. From my daughter's old bedroom, there was a long hallway that led through the master bedroom and into the living room. As I'm changing my daughter's diaper, something catches my eye, and I happen to look towards the master bedroom. There I saw, or thought I saw, the most unbelievably beautiful woman I have ever seen, next, of course, to my wife, with long, flowing brunette hair, pouty lips, and a red dress that hugged her body perfectly. I looked back down at what I was doing, not registering that this woman was in my house. I double-checked not a second later, and there was no one. I finished my daughter's diaper and walked through the house, and there was no one there with us besides me, my daughter, and my son. I mentioned it in passing to the landlord when we handed in our keys, and he said that a woman fitting that description and her young son used to live in the house when it was built in 1934. He knew the family well, as he had bought the house from them. The woman and her son were both killed when a storm tore through town, nearly demolishing the house. Guess that explains who I saw. I have only told a few people about this, and as I got older, I kind of kept it to myself. I haven't talked about it in years. When I was 9, maybe 10, I got really scared trying to sleep one night. So I ran to my mom's bedroom and told her I couldn't sleep. I stayed with her that night. It must have been a couple hours later when I was awakened by a bright light in her bedroom. My mother did not wake up. I looked over her shoulder, and I saw a white figure kind of hovering over her or right next to her. I do not remember seeing wings, but she appeared to be female and looked exactly like my mother, but years younger in appearance. She had her hands folded, and she was smiling down at my mother. She then looked at me and smiled at me. I did not get that feeling of calmness. I felt terrified. I remember rubbing my eyes really hard and burying myself under my mom because I was scared. I didn't want to look up again, but I needed to know if this was real or if I was imagining it. I slowly peeked up again, and she was there. I was scared and frozen. I was too afraid to run out of the room, plus I was in the safest spot in the world, by my mom. I stayed really close to my mom and tried waking her up. I whispered, for fear of startling it, to please wake up. Wake up. I said something was here. I didn't know how to explain it. My mom just mumbled and kept sleeping. I then closed my eyes really tight and never opened them again the rest of the night. I eventually fell asleep, and when I woke up in the morning, I avoided looking in that direction entirely. I even remember putting my hand over the left side of my face as a shield to avoid looking at that side of the room. I ran out of the room and down the hall. It wasn't until around midday, maybe a few hours later, that I was brave enough to look back down the hall and into my mother's room again. As I brought up the courage to look back at the room, I saw a somewhat large blob of what seemed like gas. I knew then that I had not dreamed of this. There it was, not as a figure but as a gas-like object. I didn't bring this up to anyone, not even my family, for years. When I was about 15, my brother and I were having a conversation, and we brought up our past. I mentioned this to him for the first time. What shocked me was his response. He saw it too. At our house growing up, we had those intercom systems. There's one in every room, so you could talk to people throughout the house. The only thing is that they were old and really worked. They could play the radio, which was cool, but we couldn't use them to talk to each other. My mom told me she remembers being in the basement with my sister and me and hearing the intercom turn on. She could hear a little static and then a very deep voice laughing. There was no one else home at the time. It wasn't the creepiest thing she had experienced there, but it still freaked her out, but she just played it cool and stayed with us downstairs until my dad got home. Another time, my parents heard a wailing coming from the downstairs of that same house. The way it was set up was that their bedroom was on the top floor, and my sister and I were on the bottom floor by the basement living room, etc. They could hear this wailing coming from directly below their room, right next to my sister's room and also mine. She said the wailing just sounded so mournful that it was really disturbing. So my dad went downstairs to check on us girls, and she remembers that as she could hear my dad moving through the house, the closer he got to where the source of the noise was, the quieter it got. By the time he reached our rooms, it was gone. Both my sister and I were fast asleep in beds. Growing up there and being freaked out by the downstairs all the time and then hearing these stories really makes me believe in something else. That house had a weird energy. I went on ghost hunts a few times. Lots of people convince themselves they saw or heard something when it's usually just a group in the next room talking or the building shifting. I never saw anything. It wasn't until I went with my future wife to her friend's house that I experienced something for the first time. I was sitting in the living room, just kind of staring across the room. I suddenly got a flash of a short woman with very dirty long hair and a white nightgown with blue flowers on it walking towards me. I shrugged it off. I tried to ignore it. I felt like she was still near me, so I said in my head, "You're not welcome here," because it was just my imagination. "Yes, I am," answered me immediately in my head in a voice I had never heard before or since. I then got a flash of her leaning over the couch with her arm around my wife's friend's husband. Seeing as I was still dating my future wife, I decided to keep that crazy SHT to myself. She noticed something was off and brought it up after we went back home. Told her. She said to tell her friend the next time I visited. I went back there and told my story, and as I'm telling it, her daughter is going ghost white, and she starts filling in her description before I can finish it. When I explained to the friend that this spirit woman said she has permission, the husband chimes in, "Yeah, I felt bad for her because I woke up one night and saw her hanged in the kitchen." The wife and daughter proceeded to chew out the dad or husband and tell her to go away right this instant. The daughter and I have never seen her since. So I come from a place where witchcraft and other paranormal stuff were very present in our culture in the past. And I think that the energy that a person has or their intentions towards what they do to others affects the actual world. There are places where you enter and you can feel something is not okay. There are people that have a bad impact on your mood, and there are objects that you dare not touch. I understand the skeptical point of view. These are very subtle feelings, and there are not always physical phenomena that you can see. Do I believe in the paranormal as we know it from the media? No. Do I believe there is still something paranormal around that we cannot explain? I went to see the Whaley House in San Diego. It's said to be the most haunted house in North America, but I don't know how true that is. I will say that the place is messed up. I've never seen a ghost before, but the way I felt there and the things I saw had no explanation. In an upstairs room, there were these small, bright orbs of light that would shoot off in all directions. I took a lot of pictures, and in the ones of the courtroom, a room in the house that was later turned into a courtroom, you can see what most people think is a demon or some entity. It's gray and looks to be crouching forward as if to spring, in a corner of the room that is supposedly a portal of some sort. There is a lot of haze in these pictures, although the room was perfectly clear. After seeing that and the sense of dread, heaviness, and dizziness I felt on the property, I do believe there is some sort of spirit world out there. I'm an atheist, through and through, simply because there is no evidence to support the existence of a supreme being. However, many years ago, I was on military standing guard duty for special weapons. A figure approached my post at night, and I prepared to challenge them. Just as I was about to challenge them, the figure darted behind a fire equipment installation. I immediately called my section leader for backup. He came out, and I covered him while he searched in the area where the figure had gone. Nothing. Normally, I would say there is some reasonable explanation, but not in this case. This was a high-security military installation with dual perimeters, multiple security fences, video, motion sensors, and other countermeasures. The area was an exclusion zone, and deadly force was authorized. There was no possible scenario where an intruder could gain access without tripping multiple alarms and activating a QRF. I still have no explanation, 30+ years later. I was at a friend's place, a very old wooden high-set house. Prior to this, he told me that it was haunted. Drawers would open and close, cupboards would open and slam shut, etc. I called it bullshit, as I'd never experienced this myself. Until one night, after playing WoW for too many hours and eating too much pizza, I decided to sleep in his lounge room as he had a futon. I heard shoes walking from right to left. Slowly, they were ladies' shoes, much like the traditional witch's shoes, with a big single brass buckle on the front. They walked slowly, from right to left, into the kitchen, paced around, and walked back from left to right. I can still hear the steps to this day. They were heavy, and there was also a scuff like the heel hit too low before the foot was placed down every other step. There were only the two of us in the house, and he was asleep in his room. I shat bricks and told him the next day. He said he heard it as well, and it's common. A few weeks later, he said that all the doors and drawers were opening and slamming shut, like something was losing its mind in the kitchen. After that, a mirror flew off the wall in the second bathroom and shattered on the floor, and everything immediately fell deadly silent. He never had any issues after that mirror smashed on the floor. I do generally try to explain away experiences as much as possible, but sometimes shit is just straight up weird, and I have no explanation for it. I've also lived in probably haunted places pretty much my entire life out of sheer bad luck. My current apartment has 2 ghosts that I'm pretty positive are there. Maybe a third, but I'm not entirely sure. All of them wander around the apartment and regularly go to the 3rd bedroom that we use as storage. I've seen a headless guy walk towards me while I was sitting in my bedroom, doom scrolling, and completely awake. My dad had seen that same guy walk through the wall behind our TV in the middle of our evening snack time, in the middle of a conversation. One time, in the middle of the night, I tripped over something knee-high in the hallway when there was literally nothing there. Like I did the whole knee smacked against something lumpy, foot drag, awkward side shuffle thing after you walk into a chair or a table sort of thing. I thought it was the vacuum cleaner, but nope, the hallway was completely empty. I watched the bathroom door open, close, then open again and thought it was my mom, only to find out she was on the opposite side of the apartment talking to my dad. I heard frustrated sighs and whispers randomly during the day in random locations. Honestly, it just feels like we're living in a space that's overlapping with another dimensional space occupied by a newlywed couple. It's pretty weird, to be honest, but not particularly scary. Just confusing and occasionally a little bit eerie sometimes. The day my grandpa died, my grandma asked me to stay the night because she didn't want to be alone. It was a very hard day for everyone, especially her. I didn't have much knowledge of ghosts or the paranormal because I was 13, and I never got into that stuff until later. I go into the guest bedroom and get ready for bed. As I'm lying down trying to sleep, I get sad thinking about the day we just had and how much I was going to miss him. I said a prayer and ended it with "I love you, Papa, good night." 1 second later, I heard his distinct voice say good night. I leapt out of bed and ran into the living room, turned on the lights and TV, and just sat there trying to figure out what just happened. A few hours later, my grandma came out, and I told her what happened. She started to cry and sat with me for the rest of the night. This was in Guatemala, not far from Samayac, a town known for sorcery and witchcraft. We had been warned to avoid that town because of it. I've met many people in Guatemala who claim to have had experiences with spirits. One described in detail how he had been cursed for not giving up the soul of his firstborn son. Anyway, there were 8 of us in a house that night, and we had been discussing creepy experiences that caused 2 in the group to move out of a haunted house by Lake Atitlan. 2 of us were stuck sleeping on the tile floor as there weren't enough beds. After midnight, we had the lights out, and it was silent. A distinctive ping broke the silence like a fork hitting a crystal wine glass as a Guatemalan quarter hit the tile close to my ear. The moment before it landed, that weird feeling of presence began. The other guy next to me immediately latched onto my side out of fear, which was oddly comforting. That was when the feeling of this thing in the room was the strongest. It wasn't a physical feeling, but I don't know how else to describe it. Moving like a breeze, it went right through me and from one corner of the room to the next as if it were trapped and wanted to escape. As it went under the bed, it rustled an empty plastic grocery bag and then exited outside through the closed door. We all jumped up as if by instinct and followed it outside to make sure it was gone. We all came to the same conclusion about what we had just experienced. None of us were under the influence of any drug or alcohol. There wasn't a prankster in the group. Could there be other explanations? Sure, but the feeling that we all felt was one of a kind and changed as soon as whatever was there left. After my grandmother, to whom I was very close, passed away, my husband and I bought her house. She and my grandfather were the original owners, from my parents, and moved in. For the first several months we lived there, we would often smell fried chicken being made in the evenings. I have never made fried chicken in my life, but it was what my grandmother always made whenever she had company come over. I would sometimes awaken to the sound of her calling me by a nickname only she and my great-grandmother used. The smells and sounds went away a few months after our arrival. Until our son was born some years later. The room that was his nursery had been my dad's when he was a kid. While he was still a baby, old enough to stand in my lap but not old enough to walk, there would be times when I rocked him and sang to him at night before putting him to bed, when he would stand up in my lap, hold onto my shoulders, and stare at something behind me. Which was just a blank wall. On a few occasions, he would babble at whatever he was looking at, as if he were having a conversation with it. He couldn't talk yet, but there would be pauses between what he said, as if someone were replying in some way, then he would reply in turn. It was super weird. But somehow I felt like it was my grandmother coming to visit. What cinched that, though, was that when my son was old enough to walk and talk, he would sometimes mention a woman he saw around the house. His vocabulary wasn't large enough for him to go into detail, but when I finally asked him one day what the woman was doing, he replied, "Broom." When my grandmother had the stroke that killed her, she was on the front walkway, sweeping away the leaves that had fallen from the trees. So yeah. I was pretty sure my grandmother was living with us most of the time we were at that house. We moved when my son was 5 and never had any experiences like that again. I decided to write up any paranormal experiences I may have had. Until I wrote this, I never believed in the paranormal. Not so certain now. 1988, 3 a.m., alone except for my dog, and sound asleep. I hear 3 very loud knocks on my front door, which is right next to my bed. I woke up and bounded to the door in 3 steps. My dog was already at the door, in alert mode, and listening. I looked out the peephole in the door, expecting to see a cop. Nothing there. Then I realized that my door was inside a gated courtyard with 6-foot-high brick walls, and the gate was locked. No one could have run off without being seen or heard climbing the gate. 2005, 4 a.m., a 22-year-old son is home from college, and I am awakened by 3 loud knocks. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once. I got up and checked out of the house. Nothing. Later that morning, my son gets up and says, "Did you hear the 3 knocks last night?" I said, "Yes, it is the second time that I have heard knocks around 3 a.m. I consulted a respected psychic, and she said that it was Grandpa checking on you and that he looks like you." My mother died in 2011. In 2014, I dreamed that I saw her face against a black background, and she said, "You are going to need a bigger patio." I woke up and said to myself, wow, that seemed real. I went about my day thinking about the experience. 2 weeks later, my son calls me and asks if he can store some weightlifting equipment at my house. I said okay, and he said he was on his way. He arrived with 2 friends in a large flatbed truck loaded with equipment. They unloaded the equipment onto my back patio, completely covering it. I watched as they filled the last remaining space on the patio, and I remembered the dream and instantly understood its meaning. My mom just let me know that she still exists. Age 10, it's summer, and I am home alone around 6 p.m. watching TV. A stack of books on a shelf above my bed shot off the shelf and landed in the middle of my bedroom. 2 a.m. I can't sleep and don't want to disturb my wife. So I go sit on the couch in the front room in the dark. The couch faces a fireplace with a TV in front of it. So, as I am sitting, I am looking at the TV. The TV is off. The screen is black. Behind me, over my right shoulder, is the doorway into the hallway, which leads to a bathroom to the left and our bedroom to the right. As I am sitting there in darkness, I notice the movement of a reflection on the black TV screen. I focused on the movement, and it looked like the reflection of a thin woman dressed in a white flowing gown floating smoothly left and right in the dark hallway door opening. The woman was just moving in the hallway left and right towards the bathroom and then towards the bedroom. I watched this for about a half hour and would look over my right shoulder into the hallway and see nothing, but when I looked back at the TV, there was the reflection of the white apparition floating back and forth. I got bored and went back to bed. My family owned this house from 1952 to 2012. There was always a presence in the house. My mother was often visited at night by the spirit of an Indian. She said that he would just stand next to her bed and stare at her. She also visited my orbs, with faces floating around her. We knew that the area was home to Indians. My mother believed that our house was built over an Indian burial ground. Back when I was 7 or 8 years old, I'm currently 31, I woke up at around 3 a.m. needing the toilet. I got out of bed, headed to the bathroom, and took care of business. Upon exiting the bathroom, I noticed something rather inexplicable on the staircase, just a few feet to the left of the bathroom door. A sliver of pure white light no more than 5 to 6 in length and probably only a few centimeters in width was bouncing up the stairs in a slow, methodical manner. I stood in silence watching this thing, utterly transfixed. I quickly came back to my senses as the light reached the top of the stairs, turned towards me, and began to take its first bounce in my direction. I became suddenly and acutely aware of the strange nature of this encounter. As I assume any self-respecting 7-8-year-old would do, I ran back into my room and hid under my duvet. Fortunately, sleep must have taken me almost immediately, because the next thing I knew, it was broad daylight. I've had a lot of weird things happen in my life, but that one stuck with me because, to this day, I have no rational explanation for whatever it was. Oh, and I cannot stress this enough, I was fully awake. This wasn't some kind of dream, and I wasn't sleepwalking. I was every bit as conscious as I would be throughout any given day. Very strange. My old house was built about 90 years ago. All the ex-bankers and financial people lived there, and in all, 5 out of 6 owners had something to do with finance, my father included. My dad and mom would leave for long weekends, and when I was old enough to stay alone, I would. Things would go missing, like hammers, game controllers, etc., and I'd find them later under couches and on top of cabinets a few weeks later. It got to the point where I'd pray to St. Anthony and find my objects in a matter of hours rather than weeks. Another pretty crazy experience, I lived in the attic. One night, I had a dream that I got attacked by a demon, and it slashed me up really good. I woke up with claw marks or something, not actual cuts but definitely hard scratch marks all up and down my back, and could see 2 red glowing eyes at the end of my room. My room was about 25 by 8, it really was a huge room. I sobbed myself to sleep that night after the eyes disappeared. My dad the next day asked me if I was up super late because he could hear a lot of movement from upstairs. I am a firm believer in the paranormal after that godforsaken house. I was like 6 years old when my grandma died. I'm an indigenous woman from Canada, so I guess you can say I was raised with awareness of spirituality and our oral teachings. I was also baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. I had a very clear memory of traveling north with my parents when my grandmother died. We have used the same funeral home for generations, so they agreed to meet us at 7 a.m. The funeral director let us in, and my mom was holding my hand because I was scared and also really curious, and she probably didn't want me to break shit. So, we were going past visitation rooms, and I looked in one and saw an old woman and a man in rocking chairs. The old man was reading a newspaper. They both looked at me and waved, and I waved back. I remember my mom giving me a quizzical look, and after we were done, she asked me who I waved at. I said to the old lady and man and asked her if she had seen them too. She said, yes, of course I did. Many years later, she told me the funeral director was the only other person in the funeral home. No one was there. It's our belief that children float between this world and the other until about the age of 7. I guess I could see them because I was still so small. But I remember it very clearly to this day, and I'm in my 30s. I saw a spirit one more time, and my mother believed it was her brother. Most of my encounters happened through dreams. We moved into my great-grandfather's house after he passed away. From my bedroom, I could see into the kitchen. The vent-a-hood light was on above the stove, and there was a bottle on the stove. My little brother was still taking a bottle, so this was normal. I woke up later that night, and when I looked into the kitchen, there was a white candle lit on the stove in the place where the bottle had been, and the bottle was gone. I didn't think much of it, but then I saw a green, hazy, transparent human figure walking down the hall. He stops at my door for about 3 seconds with their heads turned towards me, then they walk off. I froze, I couldn't breathe, scream, or move. I guess I fell back asleep and asked my other family members the next morning if they'd been walking down the hall last night. Nobody had. Used to have a delivery route, third shift. Part of my route had me passing through a national forest. The first few weeks going through this forest had the hairs on my arms standing up. It was in the first week that one day I stopped to get gas at the town just before going into the forest. I never walked away from the car, I used my card at the pump. But as soon as I get to the forest, I feel like something is in my car with me. In the backseat. I didn't see anything through the rear view, and I was petrified of turning around. But I knew what it looked like all the same. To sum it up, an old lady with a face similar to a scream mask and long, stringy gray hair. After a few weeks, I came to peace with whatever the duck was guarding the forest. I basically told it that I respect the forest, I'm not here to tear things up, litter, whatever. Months later, I'm being sent off to other areas to fill in. I'm friends with the guy that took over my route, and one night we're both talking before the routes were set out to load up, and I asked him if anything had ever joined him on the route. He knew exactly what I was talking about. I knew it was in the national forest, something in the back seat. Only he was some jackal-headed creature, not an old lady. Later, I asked someone else who used to have the route if they had seen strange things. Again, in the forest. It got to be amusing, since if I filled in on that route or anything, I never had problems anymore on that stretch. I used to see other weird things out there, though. Mostly weird lights. One night, I thought there was a police car somewhere until I realized the forest was too dense in this area for a car to be in there. There were weird flashing blue lights. There are camping areas out there, but not on that main road. I usually don't discuss this much because people try to explain things away. But they weren't there. I saw what I saw. My parents have a china cabinet that has lighting fixtures inside, so if you wanted, the dishware inside could be illuminated. Despite never being used, the cord always remains plugged into an electric socket. Growing up, I was always told stories about how, after the death of one of my grandmothers, the lights would turn on every so often and roses could be smelled in the room the cabinet was in, one of my grandmother's favorite scents, I believe. I was too young to remember any of this. Last year, I was walking through my town's cemetery. I walked this route quite regularly to avoid a busy road. I was in the oldest section of the cemetery, where people had been buried 200 or 300 years ago. For a while, I walked slowly, figuring out how old each person was when they died and reading the last names to see if I recognized any. After returning home that evening, the china cabinet lights were on. By that point in time, no one knew I had walked through the cemetery, nor was there a power outage, earthquake, or some other occurrence that could possibly explain the lights being on. The lights hadn't been turned on in years, and this was now the second house and third electric socket the cabinet had been plugged into. I think the time I spent at the graves that day might have caused something to follow me home. I stopped going through the cemetery as much and, if I did, avoided doing what I did that day. It hasn't happened since then. In the weeks that followed, my mom and I smelt roses, despite not having any in the house, nor anyone using a rose-scented fragrance. When I was 18 but still in high school, I moved in with a friend who had this huge house to herself. Her parents owned it, and it was on their property, but it wasn't super close. They owned a good chunk of land. It was an old house with an old steel or brick fireplace in the den. The fireplace had a heavy door that shut and latched with effort to heat the house. We always built a good fire and then shut the door and locked it before bed. One night I was brushing my teeth, and I heard that big, heavy steel door open. I assumed it was my roommate checking on the fire, but when I called out to her, I could tell she was in her room, opposite the den with the fireplace. So I walked over to peek into the room and noticed the shadows from the fire dancing on the walls. The steel door was wide open. I walk into my friend's room and crawl into her bed. I said, "If you didn't open the door, why is it wide open?" As soon as the sentence left my mouth, we both heard that steel door slam shut. It shook the walls. It slammed so hard. It scared the absolute duck out of both of us. It sounded like a ducking train was smashing through. She wanted to call her dad, who lived down the road, but I argued it was 3 a.m. and he would kill us if we woke him up. So we decided to go check it out ourselves. Armed with flashlights and baseball bats, we slowly walked towards the den. But when we got to the room, that door was not only shut, it was locked. There's no way that door could have done it on its own. It was not only heavy but also a witch to lock once it was hot enough. It took the both of us to get it shut. But I know I saw that door open, and I know we both heard it slam and jump at the same time. This living situation wasn't exactly the best for me, but I liked the freedoms it gave me. But over the next few weeks, it was severely impacting me. My usual goofy, Class clown self was now quiet and spacey. My friends at school kept asking me, what the hell was wrong with me? The truth is, I think that house was sucking the life out of me. There was no TV, no radio, not even a house phone. It was out in the country, and I did not have a car, so I was limited in getting anywhere, and eventually my roommate was staying over at her new boyfriend's house full time. So there I was, in this huge house, out in the middle of nowhere, with no phone. This was late 90s. I stopped building fires. I stopped eating. I remember sitting in that den and just staring at the wall until I realized I'd sat there until the sun went down and didn't realize the house was dark. I remember lying in bed, and the room next to mine, the one we didn't use, made all kinds of noises in the night. Scratching and wood groaning as if someone were walking around. That room was full of furniture. You couldn't walk around in there. I just kept telling myself it's the mice. Finally, I just couldn't take it anymore, and I called my family to come and get me. The day my family came, my grandma, who doesn't believe in ghosts, she's JW, said she went into my old room to check and make sure we got everything and said she swore she heard someone laughing. I've never been back to that house. My grandmother passed away from cancer 2 years before I was born, and my grandfather had a room where he kept all her things, such as jewelry, pictures, her china and crystal collection, etc. I moved abroad at quite a young age but would stay with my grandfather when we visited, and my brother and I would always be given her room to sleep in during our visit. It's hard to explain, really, but I always felt there was something lightly off in that room. I didn't mind sleeping there, but I also didn't hang out in that room much during the day. Even when I was much younger, before we moved abroad, the room wasn't one I would play in. I always played in the room directly next to it. Fast forward to when I was 10 years old and visiting my grandpa, staying in the room as normal. The room was super dark at night as my grandpa has these super blackout blinds and no light gets in. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I could see this floating figure at the end of my bed. What I saw I can only describe as this very white, glowing thing. As I said, there was no light in that room at night, but this thing was a bright white light. It looked like it was draped in this white see-through stuff, which floated as if the wind were blowing inside the room. It just stood there for a moment. It wasn't terrifying at all. The thing, it was almost calming. For a 10-year-old to see something like that did freak me out, and I hid under the covers until I fell asleep. I still think about this all the time. Like I said, I don't know what it is I saw. I like to think it was my grandmother since it was her room, but who knows? I have never been able to really rationalize what I saw. I haven't slept or spent more than 5 minutes in that room ever since. It's been 17 years. So basically, my parents divorced, and my mom and I moved into this house. I had a daybed. The kind you can make look like a couch and stuff. So bars are on the back and sides, but the front is free. Basically a twin-sized couch. I was in my room, with boxes everywhere. Nothing hanging up and a window in front of my bed, offset but important. I was born in 1994, so this is like 2000, so I didn't have a phone to scroll on or anything. I just look around the room and think until I fell asleep. This is before the Game Boy Color had a backlight, and I didn't even have the light for it, so I was really just laying down with all my thoughts. I was never afraid of the dark until this happened, but the light from the window was pretty bright because there was a street light near my window. So I'm looking around, trying to fall asleep, and scanning the room, not for anything but going from left to right. Then I looked to the left, and something was there. It wasn't tall or anything. It was bigger than me at 6, but not by much. It was perched on the end of my bed frame like a frog, and because it was in front of the window, it was just a silhouette. It didn't move or make any noise, but it just felt evil. It looked like it had crazy hair when I was younger, but knowing what I do know, it looked to be about 16 horns. None of them were straight. They were all curled. It just sat there and watched me. I had 3 options. Turn on the light and see it. Call my mom, and it jumps on me. Run, and it jumps on me. So I just covered my head with the blankets and didn't move at all. In the morning, I was completely covered in sweat. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't want to check on it. Really oppressive energy. I told my mom, and that's the beginning of this. I used to not believe that there was unknown stuff in the woods. I thought maybe supernatural stuff could be real, but I severely doubted it. After this happened, I knew there was something unknown out there. I had just bought my first AR-15 style rifle, Ruger AR-556 for anyone who cares, and bought a 60-round drum magazine for it at Gander Mountain while they were going out of business because, why the duck not? Reading up on the drums, I read they were amazing and rarely had any issues at all. A few days after I got it, I finally decided to take it out for a test drive, and my sight in my gun was a little better. Here's where everything went to shit. Kentucky is super wooded. 3/4 of the land I lived on was just thick woods. There was a main path for driving our gator and a few small paths our cows had made in the woods. I decided to walk along our creek, which had a small path half cleared by our cows. At the end of the path is a big field our cows graze in, and I see guns when the cows aren't there. As soon as I crossed the fence to go to the field, I instantly felt like I was being watched closely. I brushed it off because I've walked back there 1,000 times before and never been bothered by anything. So, I keep walking and ignore the feeling of being watched, but at the same time, I'm aware of the feeling. I know I feel like I'm being watched, but I wasn't giving it any noticeable attention. The walk to the field along the creek is a very short one, maybe 2 minutes at a slow pace. The further I walked, the more intense the feeling got, like I was getting closer to whatever was watching me. About halfway there, the feeling got so intense that I couldn't ignore it anymore. The drum magazine I had with me was unloaded, so I stopped and started loading it. I only brought 20 rounds with me because I was just going to sight in my gun, and 20 should have been plenty. So, now I'm stopped, paying extremely close attention to what's going on around me and loading my magazine. The exact moment I started putting rounds in the drum, I smelled something dead, like it had been dead for a while and rotting in the sun. I started looking around, and right behind me was what was left of a possum. It was torn to pieces. It was almost like it was placed there for me to find. The only thing was that it looked like it had been dead for maybe a day at most, and what I was smelling seemed like it was far more decomposed. This obviously didn't set well with me, so I double-timed it on the magazine loading. I guess I should have taken the dead possum as a last chance to turn around. I decided to keep going. I had never had any problems back there before, so I assumed my brain was just being paranoid. I was almost to the field when I saw it. I was at the end of the creek, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Just as I was near the end of the creek and the edge of the woods, I heard a splash in the water. Me being on edge, I immediately turned towards the noise, gun ready but no round in the chamber. Walking down the creek away from me was something I will never forget. At least 8 feet tall, probably taller. Very skinny. Imagine a grown man who weighs 120 pounds. Now stretch him out to be 8 feet tall, but his body width stays the same. It had very long arms, and it walked on 2 legs. The skin stretched tightly across its body. It made no noise, aside from the splash when it stepped in the creek, while it walked. It also had a very weird walk, almost like a waddle, but taking large steps. But that could have been because it was on a muddy creek bank. It was also a light brown color, almost like the color of a deer. That's all I can remember about it right now. Now I know why I felt like I was being watched. Magazine loaded, bolt ready to send a round into the chamber. Remember what I said about the magazine being extremely reliable? I pressed the bolt release on the gun to chamber a round just in case this monstrous thing decides to attack. I did not intend on striking first. The round gets stuck somehow and doesn't even budge out of the magazine. I had never used that magazine before, so it didn't fail from heavy use. A bolt closing from a gun has enough force to break your finger, so why didn't this magazine work? My only guess is that something had something to do with it. The magazine never worked right again, and I had to return it to Magpul. Needless to say, I didn't tell them this happened, I just told them the magazine failed several times. Anyway, back to the thing. The gun jammed on the first round, which is usually the easiest. The thing books it out of there without running or making a noise. I had just enough exposure to it to get the details I provided about it. Now, for assumptions. It happened in late May last year. I still have the emails from Magpul regarding the drum, so I'm using those as references because, after this, I needed something reliable. As for what the creature was, me and a friend who knows more about this stuff than I do have decided it could have been a ducking Wendigo. The reason we think Wendigo is because everything I described matches them almost perfectly. I had read that they are incredibly thin and tall, have a stench of death that follows them everywhere, which explains the smell of the possum, are very fast, can be several colors, light brown included, and that they sometimes violently kill other animals to scare humans, again, the possum. The only thing that we couldn't come up with was its behavior. Why am I still alive? Wendigos are supposed to be incredibly aggressive. Aside from watching me, it did nothing. It didn't try to attack or confront me, it ran from me like it was scared or trying to draw me where it wanted me. This being said, I have never had another encounter with it. I have gone to the same field, taking the same path, expecting to be watched, and have not gotten that feeling of being watched as strongly as that day. Something was out there, and you can't convince me otherwise. I've tried to trick myself into thinking I'm being watched out there, and it still has no comparison to that day. My boyfriend and I were in our house, eating dinner. Our front door was open, and the screen door was closed. We heard the screen door swing open and slam shut. We both went to the living room, then out onto the front porch. As soon as we went outside, we were hit by a thick, cloying floral/sweet smell. It smelled like funeral flowers. If you've ever smelled that scent before, it was just overwhelmingly strong and concentrated right in front of our house. We both felt kind of creeped out, so we went back into the house and to our bedroom. I sat on the edge of our bed, which faced the hallway, and one of our dogs came and hopped onto my lap. My boyfriend and I were speculating about what the door slamming and the smell were all about. I was looking straight ahead into the hall during a lull in the conversation, and I saw a dark shadow pass down the hall, go past our bedroom door, and into another room at the end of the hall. It was just tall, vaguely human-shaped, and solid black, like the area where it was somehow just had all the light sucked out of it and you couldn't see through it. Our dog saw it, too. He went nuts, barking, growling, and whining. For some reason, that scared me more than anything, and he saw it too. I started crying and said I wanted to leave the house, so we got our dogs in the car and left. We were having plumbing problems anyway, so we ended up just staying in a hotel room that night. When we came back the next day, things seemed totally normal, and nothing like that has happened since. It's definitely one of the spookiest things I've ever experienced. When I was in high school, I had a lot of these experiences. At the house my dad lived in at the time, it was really old, built in the early 1800s, there were plenty of times I'd be sitting in the living room and distinctly hear the cabinets opening and closing in the kitchen. It was just me and my dad that lived in the house, and you could clearly see when his bedroom door was shut and he was asleep, but you could still hear it. Normally, my dad worked 7 to 3 but occasionally worked a PM or overnight shift. One night he was working until 11, I was 17 at the time. Around 8 or so, I'm sitting in my room playing Borderlands, and I think I hear footsteps coming from the living room, which was adjacent to my bedroom, and assume my dad is home early. Go back to playing Borderlands. I keep hearing the steps, so I pause the game and listen, and the footsteps are just slowly pacing back and forth between the living room and the kitchen in a steady rhythm. I laid in bed, scared SHT, and actually counted the steps. Every time, it took 15 paces to the living room and 15 paces back to the kitchen. Needless to say, I did not ducking sleep that night. I had another situation at my mom's house about 2 years prior to this. Out of nowhere, my alarm clock would go off at midnight every night. I assumed it was busted and got rid of it. Fast forward 2 years, and my mom gets another, brand new alarm clock for my room, also when I was 17. Suddenly, the alarm goes off at midnight. I thought nothing of it and turned it off. It happened again the next night, and then my sister pointed out the old one I had that did it. So I checked and made sure no alarms were set. I double-checked at 11:56. Sure enough, 4 minutes later, my alarm goes off. I freaked out and threw it away. That next night was my dad's night to have me. I had a buddy of mine over, and my dad was working that night. He left for work around 2 a.m., and my friend had brought over an iPod dock to listen to music on. I didn't have the clock set or anything. My friend knew nothing of the last couple nights, so I knew he wasn't just ducking with me. So about 2 minutes after my dad leaves, we hear an alarm clock coming from my room. I went in, and you know how if you just plug in a clock without setting it, the numbers just blink on and off? Well, it was doing that. As soon as I picked it up, the clock set itself to 12 o'clock and then just turned off by itself. So, yeah, duck paranormal shit. I'm not religious at all, but I am 100% convinced that it happens. My current home. The common one is that we would hear random footsteps and the sound of our upstairs hall switches flicking on and off, but the lights and fan do not turn off or on. Only the switch sounds are audible. The one that scared the living shit out of me was hearing something, bang on my door desperately at 3 a.m. I used to think my parents were the ones making the switch noises and the footsteps. My parents assumed it was either me or my sister rushing to turn off the lights to act asleep when we heard them coming upstairs. So my dad did some sneaking around, and when he was positive, he heard a switch sound. I came to our rooms and noticed we were snoring. I did my fair share of investigation too and found out it wasn't done by any of us. Now onto the door banging situation. It was a Friday night, and I was super tired. I slept at probably 9 or 10 p.m. and woke up briefly at 3 a.m. to check on my phone. Then I heard it, ducking loud fist-like banging on my door for about 3 seconds. I felt the vibrations from my bed. I tried to make sense of it. My dad has a habit of banging the door when we lock it, but I flashed my phone light at it, and it was unlocked. Plus, my dad would yell our names, and I didn't hear anything. I was 20 and scared to death. I hid under my blanket and slept after some time. At lunch, I asked if anyone had done that or heard anything, to which everyone denied. It's definitely not windy since we close our windows, and it wasn't a windy day to begin with. Plus, I experienced what wind could do, and this was way different. Well, when I arrived in Mexico, I was about 11 or 12 years old. I went to live with my aunt for a few years in a big, nice, 2-story, 3-bedroom house. Let's say my aunt got on a few people's bad side, and those people were fans of witchcraft, black magic, and all that stuff that tried to find logical explanations for once they happened. My aunt and her husband left for a small vacation to Mazatlan, and just me and my 2 cousins were left in the house. One morning, we found a black rooster dead outside the house. We didn't think anything of it and just cleaned and got back to business. That night we heard the front door bust open. It was a heavy door with metal frames. You'll probably need some tools to bust that baby open. My female cousin, 12, whom we'll call AC, came crying into my male cousin's, 9, room, we'll call him JC. Being the oldest man in the house, I took it to myself to check what was going on. So I lead a scout down the stairs to see what's going on. If you look just right from the stairs, you can see straight to the front door, which is intact. Well, the moment I reached the ground floor, all the lights went out, and the kitchen cabinets started shaking, opening and closing, slamming shut. We ran back to JC's room and shut the door. Armed with what we had, a few dressers, a laundry basket, and a 2x4, we started hearing someone running up the stairs, scratching the door, going into AC's room. We had pretty thick walls, and hearing how something sniffed the room and tore it apart. The lights came back on, AC was crying her ass off, and JC was paralyzed by fear. The temperature became very chilling, you could taste the tension. I was so pale. We decided to play Halo 3 to try to drown out the noise. We turned on the TV, which turned off a few times, but after a while, it started working. We must have passed out, but when we awoke the next morning, my aunt had already arrived and had people checking the house. We moved out and went to my grandma's house, which has a few stories to tell about some good scares and some legends about the house. A few weeks later, I overheard my aunt saying something about a portal in her bedroom that was welcoming something. I think they took a priest to clean the place. And that's about it. I was living at my grandmother's house for a while, which is built in the same spot as what used to be the old County Poor Farm. This is a place in olden times where if you were homeless or needy, you could go work on the farm and have a place to stay and eat, in this small town in the Pacific Northwest. I am not sure if this is relevant, but needless to say, the place has had many people living there in the past. Anyway, it was a hot summer night. I slept naked because it was so hot. I wake up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and as I'm about to get up, I see what looks to be a human figure standing in the corner near the closet, looking in my direction. It's dark, so I'm still not sure it's not clothes in my closet making it look that way, but I'm still already freaked out. At the time, I thought that someone had broken into the house and was there to try to rape and or kill me, and had been there waiting while I slept naked, while I was totally vulnerable. I'm actually grateful in a way because I had a fight or flight moment, and I chose to fight. I get up, start yelling, "What are you doing here?" and run for the light switch. I turned the light switch and saw a fully formed man with a graying beard and blue eyes wearing traditional lumberjack type clothing who then started dissolving, just like they would show in a movie about ghosts or whatever, until he was completely transparent. My heart was beating a million miles a second, and I was in a state of high adrenaline after that, but on some level, I was glad that it wasn't a real person trying to kill me and just a ghost or strange hallucination. I'd always liked ghost stories before but never really thought they were necessarily real, but man. Just the fact that I turned on the light, maybe thinking it was a shadow, and saw a fully formed human that I could recognize details about was really freaky.